Oh, just let's see. I know it takes a few seconds for it to be live on my channel, so I'll see if I'll see if it's going live now. Right, that's for the case. So yeah, so as aforementioned in the title, this is going to be part 2 of Nathan Bedford Forrest, The Devil in the Saddle. I will be covering from September 1863. So last Friday, I ended on the note of him, of Forrest having received his independent command away from Bragg after the massive argument he had with Bragg right after Chickamauga. So that's where we started up, and the end point of the stream will be his death in 1877 from diabetes. However, I will also be talking a fair bit about controversies. For example, the thought pillow one, for example, this will be like 20-30 minutes into the stream. I will focus a fair bit on the thought pillow massacre, as it's called. I don't believe, as I will explain over the stream, it's not controversial what happened there at all. Forrest did everything in concordance with the rules of war, and he deserves no blame. And as mentioned, yeah, I will be covering right up to his death. However, I also will be, similar to what I did with Stonewall Jackson, I will also be talking a fair bit about in terms of his military acumen, just sort of like a makeshift eulogy, I suppose you could say. Good evening. Nice to see you, VA and Gativa. So without further ado, I'm going to start. I'll share a screen with. Without further ado, I'll play this.
The day of our destiny was darkened. The heart of the nation stood still when Forts Henry and Donaldson surrendered and Johnston fell back to Nashville. But the clouds which then thickened all around us served only the plainer to show the form of that hero arising to deliver us all from the foe. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. At Shiloh he charged a division and covered our army's retreat. At Murfreesboro won his promotion when Crittenden admitted his defeat. Next straight went careering before him, expecting our rear to assail. But Forrest with his fair maiden pilot soon landed the robber in jail. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Oklahoma, Memphis and Tishomingo Creek, Union City, Fort Villa, and Paducah, all the deeds of our hero bespeak. Now Athens, Sulphur Springs, and Pulaski have aroused old Sherman from his lair. For the boldest of Yankee commanders will tremble with Forrest in his rear. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Next, Johnsonville attracted his attention, where Sherman had collected his stores, and the gunboats, once terrible to mention, loaded grandly and proudly at his doors. But the Forrest Artillery Battalion, Morton, Rice, and Walton, and Crawl, set fire to Sherman's gunboats and transports, nor ceased till they had burned them all. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee.
So without further ado, that was the Bobby Horton song about Nathan Bedford Forrest, which I would recommend his music if you're into the American Civil War. Like, he's got quite there's albums of both Confederate and Union songs, if you're into that. Anyway, so where we left off last week. So after the Battle of Chickamauga, Braxton Bragg and Forrest get into a real argument, to say the least, almost borderline violent, and Forrest gets his own independent command in September 1863. Now, he was told he was mortally wounded by the aforementioned last week of Artillery Lieutenant Gould, Gould, who shot him right next to the intestine. Had he been an inch to the right, if memory serves me right, he would have probably died. The bullet would have gotten infected and he would have died. However, it just so managed to miss all of his vital organs in the area. So that's how he lives. And Gould is himself mortally wounded, where Forrest nearly disembowels the guy, to say the least. So Forrest was no joker, to say the least, when it came to someone trying. And of course, if I believe there was a guy in Apostolic Majesty's Discord who said who shared a quote something along the lines of, "No damn man kills me and lives." That's the origin of that quote. So just to cap off regarding chronology. So here, this is where it starts for his part two, raiding Western Tennessee, which becomes very much of a habit for us in the same way that Timur loved going through Georgia in his prime. Meanwhile, you do have, for example, at this point of a civil war, like you already had Gettysburg and the Army of Northern Virginia retreats to lick their wounds. Meanwhile, you also have him. Meanwhile, in the Western Theatre, you have Vicksburg having already fallen, and of course, as aforementioned, you have Chickamauga, and not long after, you have George H. Thomas smashing Bragg at Chattanooga, and then, of course, you see here, this will be what the main thrust of what we were talking about. Fort Pillow, especially, is the main thing that warrants Nathan Bedford for an unwarranted reputation, in the same way that the March to the Sea kind of scores Sherman a reputation he didn't really covet. So yeah, without further ado, so between September and December, he largely outfits his men, because it's worth noting that with Forrest, as I mentioned last week, he had a fortune of like $1.5 million, and he spent that money outfitting his men. So he had to do that from scratch again with his own independent command. So between September and December 1863, he was training and outfitting his men, and then he decides for a raid into Western Tennessee, because it's worth noting, if you see here, for example, you have railways going through areas like Humboldt, you got Bolivar, LaGrange, Holly Springs, etc. So you see Forrest, he starts out at Ripley, and then crosses the Hatchie River around here, goes over to Jackson, tearing up railways along his journey of approach, and then goes through Whiteville and Somerville down to Holly Springs. Now, yeah, it's stuff like this where Grant himself had said in his personal memoirs that with Forrest, he was taking up so many railways in Tennessee as well as northern Mississippi that it was a sense where he had to rely upon the waterways, especially as you see you up the Mississippi River, which straddled along the Tennessee-Arkansas border and nearby Memphis, for example, where, yeah, it very much was a matter of if Forrest was able to cut also the riverways, Grant would not be able to get supplies from up north. And there's only so much you can live on the land, because in the Vicksburg campaign, he did have to do that. He did have to live without supplies in the context of the Vicksburg campaign, because Forrest was just that dogged an opponent, digging into his supply lines. So, yeah, you have very much a very valuable service Forrest does here. Now, when you get on to February, you have Sherman. He sets out, he's got a plan to get into Alabama and Georgia through what's this place called Meridian down here. Now, you do have, for example, William Soy Smith. He starts around the Memphis area because he is in charge of the cavalry that's meant to cover Sherman's advance. Because Sherman knows for what how dangerous Forrest really was, and he needed a capable cavalry guy. Now, after Abel D. Straight's defeat, as discussed in the last week, Sherman has a higher bar for what he considers a high threshold for what he considers a capable cavalry subordinate, and this is where William Soy Smith really comes into play. So he sets out from Collierville, and he goes along here throughout February, and then around here at Okolona on February 22nd, there's a battle, a place called Okolona. Now, the thing about the Battle of Okolona was, so you have, so the thing about, Battle of Okolona was, this was a battle where Forrest, he does usually what does is it outflanks his force. However, he's able to do like a frontal attack as well, and then may retreat onto a ridge, which, even though the ridge kind of offered them a better defensive advantage, they were still so demoralized. And not to mention, at this time of a civil war, you start seeing colored regiments making an appearance. The thing about the black soldiers is that they really vary in quality in terms of their bravery, because on one hand, they might fight to the death, but other times, if a battle's going to against the Union, they will tuck tail and run. They're not going to stick around to get slaughtered, because at the end of the day, self-preservation and all that. So it's really varied quality among the coloured regiments, to say the least. So yeah, Okolona, very much a routed battle here. There was a previous battle here at West Point, but there's not really a great deal of detail to be said about that battle compared to Okolona, because the thing about the Battle of Okolona was you have Jeffrey Forrest, who was Nathan Forrest's youngest brother. I don't know if I mentioned him too much, but I'll mention him here. So Jeffrey was probably Nathan's favorite brother. He was the youngest, and Nathan paid out of his own pocket to make sure Jeffrey got a good education, because I didn't stress this enough last week. Forrest only received something like six months of a formal education. So one thing you notice about Forrest throughout his life is, while he is well spoken because he clearly can read and is very in tune with the newspapers and so on, but he's got terrible spelling. And some people will say, there's this stereotype that dogs a lot, and Shelby Foote, for example, talks about this, where Forrest was often looked upon as speaking in a certain way that seems backward, but he didn't. He was fairly well spoken, and despite the lack of formal schooling, and he could write. However, his spelling was pretty awful. Now, granted, I could do Shun one day with Lewis and Clark, and Meriwether Lewis, who was, I believe, Thomas Jefferson's private secretary, no doubt. His spelling was poor, and as he was, Thomas Jefferson's private secretary when Jefferson himself was president. So that's just, the 19th century was really the first time where you get standardized spellings in English, and even then it's a bit iffy. A lot of people like Nathan Bedford Forrest just struggled with it, and it didn't really hamper communication, to say the least. So, yeah, there's that. So, yeah. The Meridian expedition, as you can see from up here, around 20th of Feb, it was at this time, like, Sherman got word that Forrest defeated Smith, and he was at that point, Sherman knew he had to go back because his supplies were not guaranteed, and this is why he goes back to Vicksburg by the 3rd of March. And this is one of the many instances where Sherman he can really have a sense of hatred, like, because I believe it was during this campaign where he said to William Seward Smith before he set out, there cannot be peace in Tennessee until Forrest is dead, and it's worth killing off Forrest, or words to this effect. We must take out Forrest and his men, even if it costs us 10,000 men and bankrupting the federal treasury. So Sherman understood very early, very much at this point of the war, that Forrest was probably his greatest threat. Because you do have guys like Joseph E. Johnson and John Bell Hood later on, but Forrest was a main threat to his supplies. And if one thing about the Western theatre is that everything revolves around like railway junctions and roads and like waterways. So, for example, Memphis, very valuable place. Like Fort Pillow up here, which will be mentioned later on. You also have railways like Memphis, Ohio. You got Tennessee, Ohio Railway. You got Mississippi, Corral Railroad, and so on, which run all over the place. And it's very much a matter of you need these railways or the Mississippi River to supply your forces. Sherman, of course, he's marching inland. He needs the railways, and he needs the cavalry to keep his advance safe and tucked. But Seward Smith gets defeated, and that's the end of that brief campaign. So after that setback for Sherman, Forrest then goes on to raid into Western Tennessee and Kentucky. So you see here, he starts at Tupelo, goes through here, through Jackson, through Union City, and then crosses a border into Kentucky. So he goes into Paducah along the Ohio River. Paducah, of course, being along the Ohio River where it feeds into the Mississippi. Very valuable waterway for Union supplies. And this is where, on his return back, goes through again for Union City along the railways here. And then when he comes across Jackson, he turns towards Fort Pillow because, I will talk about, see if I can. There's a quote here about. So, if I can get back to the map. So you see Fort Pillow here. It's a very strategically located place along the Mississippi River in Western Tennessee, and the topography is relevant to the discussion. So I'll quote from this. So you have around the fort, there's a crescent-shaped ravine which goes on for half the extent of the fortress, and you have like a hollow that opens up into a place called Cold Creek. I can probably best shout here. If you can see, so you have the Mississippi River along here, and then you have Cold Creek here, which goes into the Mississippi. So yeah, you have. So along here, you have you have well dug in federal troops along here, and it's kind of like you have like this, and along here you can see like there's a bluff. That's I believe something like 75, 400. Sorry. 75 feet. I believe it said it was 75 feet high, which overlooks the river. So the fort itself is named after a guy called Gideon Pillow, who I was mentioning last week as being the guy who is one of the main culprits for the fall of Fort Donelson, which was itself a strategic disaster for the. I just remembered. Yeah, so I got the map here anyway. So yeah, So Gideon Pillow designs his fortress early on in the war. However, Confederates abandoned it early on in the war in mid 1862 because essentially it was a white elephant for them especially after the fall of Fort Henry and Donelson. And as you can see, you've got in Fort Pillow itself, you've got 580 guys, around half of whom are coloured regiments, and the other half are white. Now, the white half of the garrison, they're guys who are from Western Tennessee. And one thing about Forrest is he goes into Western Tennessee itself as well as Kentucky because a big portion of the troops that he commanded at this point of war, a lot of them deserted from a Confederate war effort. So you have this position where Forrest, in order to recruit more men, he decides to go into Tennessee and Kentucky to bring back those men into his ranks. Plus, also in the case of Fort Pillow, there's a garrison there commanded by a guy called Lionel F. Booth, who fairly competent guy. However, he dies fairly early on in the siege. So at 9 a.m., he gets killed by a Confederate sharpshooter on April 12th. So he's replaced by a guy called William F. Bradford. And the thing about William F. Bradford was he was a Tennessee guy. He was loyal to the Union. He was hated by most what he called the Tennessee Tories. So in Tennessee, if you were a Confederate supporter, you would be called a Tennessee Tory because this goes back because the Democrat Party were very much like the Conservative Party for America at this time. So Tory, Conservative, that's how you get the Tennessee Tories nickname. While the Republican supporters, so people who stayed true to the Union, these were called Tennessee Whigs because this goes back to because before the Republican Party was named so, it used to be called the Whig Party before that, whereas the Democrat Party, they sprang out of the Democratic Republican Party. They ended up splintered back from Andrew Jackson. Bit of a long story there, but that's how we get the origin of a nickname for the Tennessee Tories, as they're called. So the thing about Fort Pillow was you have this bluff that covers along the river, very strategically placed fortress, and as I've mentioned, you have two gunboats. You got New Era and Olive Branch, which are also meant to cover, and you also got like rifle pits. You've also got this Cold Creek ravine here, and you also got parapets dogging around in like a zigzag kind of formation. And then you have McCulloch, Wilson, Bell, and Bartow. They all attack simultaneously at 11 a.m. So you have the garrison inside the fortress. Now at first they were thinking, why die? However, they were promised by the two gunboats that the gunboats would load their guns with canister shot to ward off a Confederate assault. However, Morton, Forrest's artillery guy, was able to fire on these two gunboats and made close up their gun ports. So the previously offered support that the garrison were hoping to receive off the gunboats, but never came. And so the garrison was easily overcame. One thing to bear in mind is that before the first shot was even expended, the Union garrison were drunk because William F. Bradford had the bright idea of issuing whiskey, like all of the whiskey that was available within the fort. Because it's worth noting that garrison duty in the Civil War was incredibly boring, and so whiskey was one of the ways you alleviated that boredom. So you have the troops, especially the coloured regiments, they are just drunk on whiskey. They can't handle a drink very well. So one thing you'll notice is that the Confederates, they attack with something like 1,200 men against a force of 580. Now you think, outnumber the enemy 2-1 in a well-defended position, you think they should have heavy casualties, even despite synchronized assaults and so on. The Confederate casualties from this entire siege were 16 killed because the Union garrison were just drunk. Like they were so inebriated that this also leads to a complication later on where once the Confederate troops break into the fortress, you just have this position where at this point, it's worth noting that Forrest did invite a surrender, but Bradford acting like he was saying that like Booth wasn't declared dead, like as in Bradford carried on this ruse that Booth was still alive. He says, no, we won't surrender. And it's at this point, that's when, of course, the assault happens. and it's just a bloodbath here because you have in the case of the black soldiers, a lot of them tried to swim into the river, trying to get over to the sandbar or get into the gunboats, and a lot of them just drown because as they're drunk and they're not in no fit condition to do bloody anything really. But meanwhile, the white troops are able to hide. So one charge of this is levied against Forrest in this is a claim that he specifically ordered the black soldiers all be massacred. No, like it's worth noting in the negotiation for any sort of surrender, Forrest was willing to treat the black soldiers on equal terms of how he would treat the white soldiers. But it's worth noting that both white soldiers and black soldiers in this fort were hated by the Confederate soldiers, the whites, of course, because they were Tennessee guys who they were neighbors of many of Forrest's men. So, to quote, if anyone's watched that film Lincoln, where Jared Harris plays Ulysses Grant, where Ulysses Grant says like the war gets intimate and ugly. Fort Pillow was the best case example of it, where you have Tennessee guys on both sides who are just killing each other, and the thing about the Tennessee Union guys was a lot of them were either deserters from the Confederate cause who joined up with the Union for better conditions or like just because of its winning side, and the Confederate Tennesseans, they saw this as just outright betrayal to the point where they would have no quarter towards this Union garrison. So this is how it gets particularly very bloody. And the blacks, 2/3 of the black soldiers in this garrison are killed off. A lot of them do drown. So it's not just that they're killed, it's also a matter that a lot of them drown because they're not smart enough to hide like the white troops were. And that's why the casualties. So it's like 1/3 of the white soldiers at Fort Pillow were killed, whereas 2/3 of the black soldiers were killed. That's why the casualties are so lopsided. And to this day, there's these pervasive rumors that, Forrest ordered some racial blood war kind of massacre. And it's like, no, that's not true in the slightest. Now, there are multiple sources that will say one, and Forrest said, kill them all. And other sources that say Forrest tried to abate the slaughter. Now, I will say, let's say for argument's sake, it was a former. I said Nathan Bedford Forrest didn't do anything wrong because he did invite them to surrender. They refused to surrender, knowing full well that by reputation at this point, they knew what Forrest would do if they refused to surrender, and he took the fortress. And so, yeah, there's no moral wrong that was done by Forrest in context of this siege. And the casualties were like 50% on the part of the garrison, which is perfectly standard for a siege. So I would say Forrest didn't do anything wrong in the siege. And I said, yeah, you've got the parapets here where you got Confederate sharpshooters picking them off. You have McCulloch on the left flank. He takes the first level of fortifications in a shock assault. Lieutenant Leeming was a guy who delivered the reply to Forrest saying, "We will not surrender." And then, yeah, this is where you get the parapet, and you got like a bit of a ditch, and you get the Confederate soldiers climbing over. And as I said, it was just a matter of once they start climbing the parapets, a lot of the Union troops just panic. They throw down their guns and they try to make good either their escape or try to hide wherever they can in the ensuing slaughter. So after Fort Pillow, you have him. He goes south through Memphis, and he goes through Collierville, through Ripley, and then eventually and this is where he starts to defend northern Mississippi from a guy called Andrew J. Smith, who sets out also from Tennessee, because his job was to cover Sherman again, as well as to deal with Forrest, to try and deal with him a decisive defeat. Now, the thing about Bryce's Crossroads was, if you can see, you see, for example, dense vegetation. You got the roads to Guntown, Baldwin, you've got the crossroads here. You've also got this bridge, and you've got Samuel D. Sturgis, who's the commanding officer. Yeah, this is the situation you've got now. It was mid to late morning where you have Forrest. He decided, because it's worth noting on this particular day, the Federal cavalry arrived first, and the thing was, the weather was raining quite a lot, but it was also quite dry on that particular day. So Forrest understood intuitively that the cavalry were going to be 3 hours ahead of the infantry. So he had a free window opportunity by which he could destroy the cavalry in detail and then move on to the infantry when they come across the bridge. And that's how that's the thing. The infantry were massively exhausted, to say the least. You do have the Federal forces on the front lines. They were commanded by a guy called Benjamin Grierson. Grierson, I did mention last week as being the cavalry guy who helped Grant in the Vicksburg campaign, which I'll mention in more when I do Ulysses Grant later on this month. But yeah, you have this Grierson, competent guy as he was very much on the back foot. There were elements of surprise. Forrest, he outflanked, he shot from the rear. It was just an unwinnable battle for the Union. So yeah, you just have this situation where it's just you have guys like Waring, Winslow, you got McMillan, you got some of these Sturgis back here, and he does deploy batteries, but the thing was they was enfilading fire because I believe where is it again? There's it. You see like you've got good vegetation on this side for these particular guns, while on this side they're striking down a slope, so to speak. They've got the advantage of a high ground here. So the Federal batteries, they can't really do much against the Confederate batteries because they've really got good cover, as well as a good vantage point to strike against the Union forces. And then later on in the battle, you have a 2nd Tennessee Cavalry that circles around to try and assail around Tishomingo Creek. Now, these 3 regiments here, they were coloured regiments. They were held in the rear guard because at this point, it was still early days for the coloured regiments. Don't be afraid to ask me questions. I say don't be afraid to ask me questions. I'm perfectly happy to answer them. If they can be, if there are questions about, let's say, a battle right now, for example, I'm talking about, then I'll answer them pretty much straight away once I've done talking, or I can do them at the end of a stream, depending on what the question is. So I said, don't be afraid to ask me questions. You have a 2nd Tennessee Cavalry. They're not successful in their attack because this coloured regimental of rear guard. They do fight really doggedly because it's worth noting one thing that Forrest gets dogged for, like after Fort Pillow, is coloured regiments make an oath from that point onward where they say we will not give Forrest any quarter in the event of victory against him, and we will. And this is one thing where it would be later accused that Forrest does not give Federal troops any quarter in later battles, which is worth noting the Federals were doing exactly the same thing towards him in the event of success. So this is one thing where Forrest gets unfairly blamed for something which the other side were doing. And these coloured regiments, they fight doggedly. However, once they see the battle's lost and Samuel D. Sturgis is retreating his men across back towards Memphis way, these coloured regiments, they're bugging you out as well because they're not going to get killed fighting for the rest of the Federal Army. They'll fight doggedly for a time, but once they run out of ammunition or once their morale has gone, that's it. That's it. Like they tuck tail and run as well. So Price's Crossroads. I mean, I haven't read Shelby Foote's books, but I know Shelby Foote, he spends a fair bit. Well, he says this is Forrest's magnum opus because it was really a tactical masterstroke in the sense that you have him outflanking and attacking from the rear, using the ground to his advantage. Because this is one thing Shelby Foote would say about Forrest: is once he saw a piece of ground, he knew how to use it. Very intuitive, and as mentioned, he didn't have a formal schooling, for example, so he didn't even go to West Point. So this just accentuates brilliance, which. As I'll mention later, I believe Nathan Bedford Forrest, unlike Stonewall Jackson, but at least Stonewall Jackson had a military education, so he had more advantages than Forrest did at the start of war. This is where I start to believe that Forrest was probably the most brilliant guy produced by either side on the American Civil War. Grierson was also himself brilliant in his own way, but I think no one can match up to Forrest, and this battle kind of proves it, where you have just very unwinnable situation for the Federals, to say the least. And yeah, as I say, you have hand-to-hand fighting, which, contrary to popular myth, I think like hand-to-hand fighting was only like 1% of all casualties from the Civil War, but you did have instances of it. So, for example, I don't think I mentioned too much on that Stonewall Jackson stream, especially where, because on the first Battle Bull Run, he says, "Oh well, if they advance against us, we shall give them a bayonet." Only like 1% of all casualties in the Civil War actually from a bayonet. Is there much truth? That was true for March 1865, where Jefferson Davis finally approves of it. There's an Irish fella who lived in Arkansas who serves as a division commander at this time of the war by the name of Patrick Claiborne, who I'm interested in doing the stream about Patrick Claiborne one of these days, later on in the year, because Claiborne had the idea that the slaves should be given their freedom in exchange for them fighting for the Confederacy, because there are 4 million of them and they would do much to help the manpower disadvantage the South had. However, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet only approve of this in March 1865, by which time the war was well lost. And, you got Lee bottled up in Petersburg, so it's too little too late on that one. But yeah, there were plans to do it. It was just if I were to do a stream about Jefferson Davis, as I will say about latter end of this stream, I just think the Confederacy, a lot of it, they make good decisions way too late in the war, and this is one of them where they should have done this after the Emancipation Proclamation, but the Southern planters just didn't want to have slaves given conditional freedom for their fighting, even though, as I mentioned in that Stonewall Jackson stream, slavery was gone anyway, and a lot of the Southern planters just refused to accept that reality. So yeah, this is one thing about Captain Morton's artillery: very rapid deployment and very adept use of the ground. And yeah, this is where you get the retreat of the Federals across Tishomingo Creek. Now, I don't remember reading about the bridge collapsing, but there was like a massive panic towards the end of the battle, which, even though the Federals were not known for retreating, yeah, you did have this situation where many guys were eager to panic. I mean, you did have wagons turned over. Hold on. That's it. I don't know what happened there. So yeah, after Boyce's Crossroads on June 10th, and I have someone say, not long after this, you have a battle called Harrisburg. It's also called Tupelo. It was a bit confusing, to say the least, because you have two battles called the same. So yeah, the thing about Harrisburg was, so it says Forrest here because the thing about this battle was it was commanded by a guy called Stephen Lee, because it's worth noting that Forrest, while having his independent command, the problem was he was under a department commanded by the name of Stephen Lee. Now, Stephen Lee is actually related to Robert E. Lee, but Stephen Lee comes from a less prestigious branch. He comes from a North Carolina branch of the Lee family. So he's like a distant, I think it was like cousin or second cousin, something like that, of Robert E. Lee. A relation of that sort, anyway, like too distant for them to know each other, but notable nonetheless. So yeah, you have A.J. Smith here with his headquarters on the Tupelo Road, and this is Harrisburg. Now, Stephen Lee, he orders pretty much like this frontal attack, which, to say the least, it was just ill-advised. The Federals were dug in on good ground of their choosing. They had you can see you got vegetation along the way, so you got tree lines and so on, and you got like a small waterway called Kings Creek. But you've also got flat ground around here, like open ground, which charging along open ground against a well-dug-in enemy. Yeah, it's fair to say this is a sort of Western theatre miniature version of what happens with Pickett's charge. So yeah, this is held against Forrest to say he was defeated. No, because 2 weeks before this battle, because this happened in July, the previous battle, Boyce's Crossroads, happened a month earlier in June. So 2 months before this battle of Harrisburg, Forrest was sick with boils. So he said to Lee, "Look, I'll pass over command to you temporarily while I recover." And so Forrest in the battle, he was actually with Roddy on the extreme right. And the thing was, yeah, as you can see from arrows here, it was very confused on my left flank. And you have Crossland, who also tries to attack, but it's very disjointed. It's not well coordinated, and it's kind of the worst of all worlds for the Confederates. Now, it wasn't a disaster for the Confederates because they lost a couple of hundred killed and over 1,000 wounded. They had a force of like 7,500, and they were going up against a Federal force that numbered them. It was something like 16,000 Federals against 7,500 Confederates. So it wasn't a disaster where they didn't lose any of their guns or anything, but it was still a stinging defeat nonetheless for the Confederates. And this defeat secures Sherman from having to deal with Forrest for a while. I don't know why I put Jeffrey Forrest there, because I was meant to put it with that was a mistake on my part from earlier. I meant to put it with the earlier battle of Okolona. So yeah. Not long after the Battle of Tupelo, between July and September, you have this Forrest just recuperating from his wounds he suffered at the Battle of Harrisburg, because I believe he fell off it. I believe his horse was shot from underneath him and he got bruised. Not scathing, not as in like that could have invalidated him, but it was an injury nonetheless he had to recover from for a short while. So yeah, you have. This is where he gets into. It was in northern Mississippi that you have a Battle of Harrisburg, and it's later on he has to get into northern Alabama, and then he gets into central Tennessee. I'm losing track of myself. Yeah, so you have around here a place called Cherokee in northern Alabama, because it's worth noting that a lot of this land, like Georgia, Alabama, way, used to be Cherokee country before Andrew Jackson, with his Trail of Tears battle controversy, which I'm planning on doing a stream one day about Andrew Jackson, so I'll deal with that controversy, because it's something which is a very nuanced thing in American history. So yeah, Cherokee, sets off from here on September 21st, and he goes right up to here at Spring Hill, and at Spring Hill, that is actually a notable place, but it's not. A couple of months later, in a Nashville campaign on a Job L. Hood, so I'll mention that in accordance. And you have. Oh, sorry, I lost track of myself. So he sets off from Cherokee, goes through Florence, goes over to Athens, in northern Alabama. He goes through Elkton, through Pulaski, Fayetteville, goes through here, and he raids all along the way to deal with basically to do with federal logistics for Sherman, because at this point in the war, so September, October time, you have the March to the Sea, and he was hoping to do what little he could to try and frustrate Sherman's advance. Because it's worth knowing, Joseph E. Johnston was in charge of the Army of Tennessee, as it was called, and you have Forrest. He's raiding as best he can for supplies. It's worth noting that Forrest, because he was operating behind federal lines, this is how he supplied his forces, by looting off federal arsenals and the like. So you have him raiding into central Tennessee, and I say, like, for example, you got Pittsburgh Landing here, which was an earlier battle. Shiloh, Thompson Station, which is sort of an earlier battle. Franklin, there's a battle that happens here later on, which will happen later, like November, December time. So now into October time, you have what's called a Johnsonville expedition, where So he sets out from Corinth, northern Mississippi, and he goes through Jackson along Forked Deer Creek, and then he goes through here over here to Paris Landing, which you notice here is a very valuable waterway because you got Fort Henry here, which had been in federal hands since Grant took it in February or late January, early February, 1862. Paris Landing, as I said, like you got the Tennessee River waterway has been very important, naturally, very valuable kind of area for logistics for Federals. Here at Johnsonville, on November 3rd into November 4th, there's a load of gunboats and supply ships on the Tennessee, which through using artillery very adeptly, he's able to very much deal significant damage and loot all the supplies. And you have this position where November 6th, I believe it was, there's that famous communique that Sherman writes to Grant, where he said, that devil Forrest has been making havoc among the gunboats at Johnsonville a few days ago. And yeah, it's really stuff. It's stuff like this that kind of shock us how dangerous Forrest was to Union supplies, because he's able to, because one of the ships, for example, had blankets, which were very valuable in the winter to come. And this is worth noting, at this stage in the war, you have situations where in line, because when he gets back November time, one thing he does before the Nashville campaign, which happens later on, he's having to give away like something like 3 weeks furlough for his men. Because the thing was, at this point of the war, I think into November you get the US election where Lincoln gets re-elected. Now, Lincoln gets re-elected, and what chances that Sev had of perhaps getting some sort of peace that could somewhat go their way were gone. Like, they were just demoralised, and a lot of the men that Forrest had with him, because it's worth noting at this point of the war, it's not just the soldiers that are suffering, it's also the civilians, because you have loads of stragglers and deserters just all over the countryside, all over places, like for example, Tennessee. There's plenty of families that get victimized by deserters. Like if you ever watch a film, Cold Mountain, where there's a scene where you got Cillian Murphy playing a Union soldier alongside other Union soldiers. It's like a film where they just victimize this Virginian family. That kind of thing happened all the time, especially at this stage of war, where a lot of guys, mainly Confederate soldiers, deserting. They just want to get back home, and they just want, and because the Confederate currency means bugger all at this point, it's worthless, because Richmond is not far from falling until later on, as you get into 1865. A lot of the troops are reduced to plundering, and Robert E. Lee, as technically he wasn't commander-in-chief of all Confederate forces yet, but he does issue orders as best he can to everyone in the Confederate Army to say, look, plundering off the population is not allowed. But it's easier said than done, as said, because a lot of these Confederate troops who are either going through the countryside marching or deserters, well, their currency is worthless. They're gonna get their food one way or another, so we'll just take it off a local population by force. It's just one of those things that, again, civil wars are intimate and ugly. So yeah, into November, after the Johnsonville expedition / campaign, you have in northern Alabama, he meets up with John Bell Hood, who's in command of the Army of Tennessee. Joseph E. Johnston, at this point, he was replaced. He was gotten rid of on November 25th, and on November, and the thing was it October? I'm getting my dates a bit mixed up, but yeah, late October. I think it was late October or late November. Either way, yeah. Basically, Joseph E. Johnston, he gets replaced by John Bell Hood on the advice of Braxton Bragg, because it's worth noting Bragg was advising Jefferson Davis as a military advisor, which, if you thought Braxton Bragg was bad as a commander of Confederate forces in the Western Theater, him as a military advisor also does his own fair share of follies, where he advises John Bell Hood to take over command of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Now, I should have included a picture of John Bell Hood, but yeah. So yeah, John Bell Hood, like this is a guy. Now the thing about Jumbo Hood, it's this picture doesn't happen at the time I'm talking, but yeah, he was 30 years old or 31 years old at the time he was given command of the Army of Tennessee. So he was a fairly young chap. His left arm was made useless because he suffered a wound. Like his arm got smashed by a bullet at Gettysburg. At the Battle of Chickamauga later on in 1863, he loses his right leg. Like his right leg gets severed at like 2 inches below the hip. So by the time he gets over to, by the time John Bull Hood is commanding the Army of Tennessee, you imagine he's suffered his fair share of PTSD, and the thing is, he gets really, and he's by instinct he's very aggressive, and he's the kind of guy where he should never have been in command of the army. But Jefferson Davis puts him in charge on the advice of Braxton Bragg, and well, this wasn't what the Confederates needed. They needed Johnston or someone of his cautious nature to deal with Sherman. But yeah, and yeah, the thing about Hood was also he fought also. I forgot. I also mentioned Hood in the context of Battle of Antietam when I was talking a couple of weeks back when I was talking about Stonewall Jackson. Hood was actually commanding his brigade under Jackson on the left flank of Antietam, where 80% of his men were casualties by the end of the battle. And Lee actually said to him, "Where is your command, Mr. Hood?" And Mr. Hood said, "My command will all have been dead or wounded." Antietam was such a bloodbath for Hood's men. But yeah, Hood was a very brave guy. He's kind of like the Marshal Ney, I suppose you could say, of the Confederate Army. Dependable, but he's not the guy you want in independent command. He should never have been commanding the army, and it wasn't what the Confederates needed. And at the risk of sounding like a bit of a boomer, it's kind of like, there's that meme about Steiner's attack in that Downfall film in April 1945. If Steiner were to attack in real life, it would go the same way as what Jumbo Hood's attack on Nashville went. So yeah. So you have the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Yeah, you have they set it from Tuscumbia in northern Alabama. They go up here to the Duck River nearby Columbia, skirmish along the way. So you have Sherman. He does shadow Hood for a while, but once Hood has crossed Gadsden in the midst of October, this is where he decides to back off, and he goes towards Atlanta, towards his march to the sea, while he dispatches guys like Schofield and Thomas to deal with Hood. Because I think, Sherman said he wants to focus on the march to the sea. So yeah, as you get into the latter end of November, you have Hood marching through to Columbia, and he crosses the Duck River. Spring Hill, I did mention Spring Hill. One of the wackiest things in the American Civil War happens, to say the least. Something which you think to yourself, at this stage in the Civil War, both sides are blooded, they're veterans, to say the least. And yet it happens. So you have a battle where you got Chalmers, like you got guys like you got Hood in command, you've got Cheatham, you've got guys like Forrest, Menhill, and Wright, you've got Cheatham, you got Stewart, Claiborne, as I said, he was a very capable divisional commander. He got blacklisted by Jefferson Davis for recommending that the slaves be given their freedom in exchange for fighting for the Confederacy. So, I will do a stream about him at some point, because Shelby Foote also reiterated in an interview back in the 80s that Claiborne was probably one of the best Confederate commanders. I mean, Claiborne was actually nicknamed the Stonewall Jackson of the West, and you don't get nicknamed like that in the Confederate Army for nothing. So that's kind of tells you about Claiborne a fair bit. So yeah, early afternoon, Forrest's cavalry subordinates, guys such as Rucker, Chalmers, Biffle, and Armstrong, they attack Lane's Federal forces around the town of Spring Hill around here, and they have to pull back. Because meanwhile, you have Cheatham and Bate. They attack around latter end of the afternoon, so 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Cheatham, he is worried about because he was worried that his forces, especially with Bell, aren't properly, their left flank isn't properly supported So he orders bait to go up here, right up to the Cumbria Pike, and come nightfall, because this is November time, so nightfall happens a lot earlier than it does in the summer. They set up camp along this Columbia Turnpike. Now, as you can see, Schofield, who wasn't in the battle as of yet, he, in the midst of the night, marches his troops along here in the dead of night. There were Confederate pickets along the turnpike here, but were like 10, 15 yards away. So you imagine like your average regimental or brigade commander under Bate, for example, guys like Lowry or Granbury and so on. They should have raised up the alarm. And Schofield advancing right up to this road in the dead of night. Like it was one of the wackiest things you can. It was probably one of the wackiest things you can read about in the Civil War. Just like an entire Federal army just marching right past a Confederate army in the dead of night within like 10 to 15 yards. Like the Federal troops marching, they could actually be heard by the Confederate pickets. So there's no excuse why. It's not even a matter you can blame Cheatham or Bate, because they were decent guys, but they weren't equal of someone like Longstreet or Jackson in the Eastern Theatre. So Hood was doing the best, I suppose. And Hood, to this point, didn't really do anything wrong. It was more the regimental and brigade commanders on the ground who were at fault for not raising the alarm. And yeah, they managed to cross in the dead of night, crossing back McCutcheon's Creek, meeting up with Stanley's forces and Opdyke, and then they march over to Franklin, which is like a day's, not even a day's march away. So Hood, the following morning on November 30th, he's absolutely livid when he sees that the Federals have retreated in good order, and none of the troops and none of the Federal troops were assailed along their retreat, despite it being really pretty obvious. Like, very much of a, I suppose wacky would be probably the best word I can think of for how just seriously stupid it was that the Confederates didn't have this massively missed opportunity and didn't exploit it. So yeah, you get the Battle of Franklin. So you have Battle of Franklin. Now, it's worth noting that the likes of Schofield, Stanley, and the other guys, so on, they are well dug in short, but they weren't doing it because they wanted to hold there. They were planning on getting to Nashville, which is further up north, like around here would be on the map, further up north. So they were just dug in as a moment of prudence. Now, the thing about Hood was, because he was so irritated by his subordinates' failure to destroy the Federal army at Spring Hill, and which would have, that was his plan, to defeat the enemy army in detail rather than having to defeat them all at once in one battle, although he was aggressive anyway. Yeah. You have his Battle of Franklin, which it was a massive tragedy for the South, and we'll go over. So you see the Federal troop dispositions here. You got the earthworks well dug in. You've got the river to their backs, because the thing was, there's a bridge around here, but the problem was the bridge was in disrepair, so the engineers had to fix that. So in the meantime, for November 30th, as you get into early December, they had to hold up here and just wait for the engineers to fix it. And yeah, this is where you get Hood. He chooses to attack. He doesn't listen to any of his subordinates like Claiborne, who say, no, you should try and outflank, like try and attack here, or trying, for example, one thing Forrest recommends is that he gets his forces to try and outflank the Federal forces around it. You can find like a Hughes Ford here, for example. He was offering he said to Hood, look, give me a division of infantry. Let's say give me Claiborne's division, and I can get round to the Murfreesboro Road and get behind these Federal well-dug-in forces. Hood doesn't listen to him because Hood was made to wait a lot longer than he wanted to for Forrest to join him from a Johnsonville expedition. Now, Hood here, he's on Winstead Hill, which I imagine like the topography is outlined here. You've got some woodland here, you've got the sawmill, the toll gate, the two fords around here, and you've got really open ground. But if you want to get Hood's point of view, so this is what Hood would have seen. and you see like it's all like it's well-tilled farmland. You see houses, like some farmhouses here, and this is a town of Franklin here in the background. So Hood is basically doing like a massive, like, you think of Pickett's charge, which is something like 12,000 men, if I remember correctly, 12,000 men under Pickett charging on July 3rd. You got 20,000 men doing the exact same thing, just upon a well dug in federal force right in front of his town. And they're doing it right in open ground. And you have guys like Claiborne, who, capable as they are, like, they're not going to be able to get the better of this mess, to say the least. Yeah. And so, yeah, you have the attack, which happens all day long, including to 7 p.m., where you have Stephen Lee, who at this point is a corps commander under Hood. And the thing about Stephen Lee was Forrest was commanded, before he joined up with Hood, he was commanded over by a guy called Richard Taylor, who was the son of Zachary Taylor, who was US president in 1850 before he died. So, yeah, I said you have, it was just a matter of so many errors made on Hood's part, like, so stupid, just a massive frontal attack. You have a Harpeth River. He doesn't even attack along the entire length and breadth of the federal line. You do have Wagner, like, because the thing was, you have this guy called Opdyke, who was an Ohioan guy from northeastern Ohio or northern Ohio, that kind of way. He said to Wagner, "Look, I will be damned if I'm going to let my troops be in the advance around here." So Wagner's position gets overrun fairly quickly, and Claiborne's men here, they fight. The Carter house here. You can imagine the Carter family, they were in their basement, just like they were just having their hands around their ears, just hearing all the carnage right outside their house. Claiborne is probably one of the most successful guys on this, because there's like, you got Wagner's troops who are retreating, and the thing was, the Cottingen around here, there's like Claiborne's troops and Brown, they're able to get some headway, but eventually they're turned back. Claiborne, unfortunately, he gets killed, and that's probably the single biggest loss of this entire battle, of this entire phase of the Civil War altogether for the Confederates. One of the best guys the Confederates had in their army, or even on the Western Theater altogether, and he got killed. Like, the thing was, he got lost in, because I believe it was a misty day, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the weather was also described as fairly misty, or like very smoky because of all the gunpowder going off. Claiborne, at first he was considered missing because they couldn't find his body, but they found his body. He unbuttoned his coat, and there was a bullet hole in his torso because basically he got shot. And it wasn't friendly fire; it was a matter of Union troops firing on him. And yeah, I believe and I think all the colonels, a lot who were attacked here, all of them were either killed or wounded, and 6 generals were killed on the Confederate side by the end of this battle. So, out of a Confederate army of 20,000, 7,500 are killed or wounded. Just an outright disaster for the Confederates. This Battle of Franklin was. You can also go there's no other way to put it. Just an outright disaster for the Confederates on this day. And yeah, they lose 6 generals who actually end up on the porch of Carter House. And another thing, so Carter House, the Carter family, they had a guy called Theodore who was fighting on the Union side. He was actually fighting inside of his own family's garden, no less, when he got shot in the head. And he was taken over to his dining room table in his own house, where his family got to say goodbye to him before he passed from the shot in the head. So yeah, it was just a matter of there's no other way to say it other than this was just a Greek tragedy. Like you can't say comedic farce, because I don't think it fits it. I would just say just tragedy all around. And you see, like the Abbaties, which are kind of like, I'll see if I can find a Abbaties, because so an Abbaties of, I'll get a picture for it. this is what an abattis would look like. It's meant to ward off cavalry, which if anyone's ever played Napoleon Total War, for example, this is what you deploy for your skirmish, for your line infantry or your skirmishers. So this is what an abattis looks like for anyone who might be slightly confused. Yeah. So as you get into the new year of 1865, you have the Confederates now back foot. The Army of Tennessee is smashed up because they do go to battle again right up to Nashville, and they just get destroyed. Like, the Army of Tennessee is no longer an actual fighting force at that point in the war. So yeah, it's fair to say that it was just Hood, who I would blame mainly Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg for that particular defeat more than anything, because they're the ones who put John Bell Hood in command. They should have kept Joseph E. Johnston in charge, or promoted someone like Patrick Claiborne to be in charge of the army. But it's kind of one of the things where it's tragedy, but born by poor strategy, to say the least, on the part of the Confederate High Command. And yeah, it was a completely avoidable disaster. We should have remained on the defensive, but we didn't, and the disaster happens. So yeah, as you get into the latter end of March 1865, you have a guy called James H. Wilson who leads something like 20,000 cavalry, probably the biggest cavalry force marshaled up in the war. So leads from Waterloo here in northwestern Alabama, and he leads them down here. So you got Eliton, or Birmingham, if you want to say the American way, and yeah, he goes over to Selma. Now, Selma was a main objective because it was the last manufacturing center it was the last major manufacturing center the Confederates had. Should have flagged this up earlier, sorry for my part. Yeah, that was the thing. Yeah, you have. I mean, so for example, you might have, for example, guys from New England dying in midst of Virginia, or a guy from Ohio dying at Shiloh, and he would just be so far away. Yeah, so I suppose in a way it was kind of a small mercy. They happened to die in his side of his own home, in a sense, tragic as ever it was. And as I keep mentioning, civil wars are by their nature intimate and ugly. So yeah. Why did the Army of Tennessee not surrender? Basically, yeah, it's the same with Forrest and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. They were just fighting. They were fighting to the bitter end. Basically, they were fighting until it was only with Richmond falling in April that you actually get the surrender being taken in place, because it's similar in a sense to what happened with Germany in World War II, where the Confederates knew that they were not going to get good peace terms by this point of the war. They weren't going to get they believe they weren't going to get good peace terms, because it's worth noting that Lincoln got re-elected, and there's a lot of radical Republicans in Congress who are very much vengeful towards the South. Guys like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. So yeah, it's despite being heavily battered and despite not being much of a fighting force, they still fight to the bitter end, basically, despite heavy desertions and so on. Yeah. So yeah, we lost some track. So you have James H. Wilson. He goes over here. You do have small skirmishes along the way, but yeah, it's just a matter of Selma falls on April 2nd, the same day that Petersburg falls, and a week later, on April 9th, that's when you get Robert E. Lee surrendering, and that's the de facto end of the American Civil War, pretty much. Although technically, you still have, because it's worth one thing people don't know about is that the last surrender of Confederate forces happened there. I think it was in Texas or Oklahoma, Cherokee guys fighting for the Confederacy, because that's one thing people don't realize. A lot of Native Americans were fighting for the Confederates because Lincoln. One thing about Lincoln that people don't realize is that Lincoln might have believed in abolishing slavery, but he certainly did not believe in racial equality. in a way that people think he does to this day. And one way that was shown was in the Wild West, where he deploys guys like John Pope to get rid of a Sioux tribe in Minnesota and North and South Dakota. So the Indian Wars were still going on at that point, and yeah, it was just really a matter of Lincoln isn't the left-wing hero that a lot of libtards think he was, and so that's why you get these Cherokee tribes, for example, like Cherokee tribe, I should say, fighting for the Confederates in Oklahoma and Trans-Mississippi Theater kind of way. So yeah, the thing about Selma, I mean, people say this was a stinging defeat, like this was a massive defeat for Forrest. I probably will be a bit more charitable towards Forrest, because at this point in the war, there was so many desertions, so much attrition. Like both sides of the war feel fairly wearied, but especially the Confederates, because by this point in the war, like, I mean, you got to factor, someone like Forrest, as well as quite a few of these guys, where guys from Tennessee, they're fighting in southern Alabama. And they know full well the war's gone. They're just fighting to survive. They're not really fighting anymore for the chance of victory. They're fighting because they've got nothing else going for them at this point. So Selma falls the same day as Petersburg, and then Richmond being evacuated. And this is where a week later you get the surrender at Appomattox. Yeah, and Selma. I'm going to keep comparing to World War II, because it's what a lot of people know. Selma falling does the same effect upon the Confederacy as the fall of the Rhineland and Silesia for the Germans in the Second World War, where it's just whatever capability there was is gone. So yeah, you have. I'll try and find a quote. Try and find a quote now. So, on a month after the fall of Selma, so this is April, it takes some time for news of Lee's surrender and the surrender and the defeat pretty much of the South after the fall of Richmond to spread to the rest of the South. So it's only really May 9th that Forrest does actually surrender his command. So I'll quote this particular speech after Lee has already surrendered, for example. So he said, "It is the duty of every man to stand firm at his post and true to his colours. Your past services, your gallant and heroic conduct on many victorious fields, forbid the thought that you will ever ground your arms except with honour. Duty to your country, to yourselves, the gallant dead, who have fallen in this great struggle for liberty and independence, demand that every man should continue to do his whole duty with undiminished confidence in your courage and fortitude, and knowing you will not disregard the claims of honour, patriotism, and manhood, and those of the women and children of the country, so long defended by your strong arms and willing hearts. Your commander announces Forrest announces his determination to stand by you, stay with you, and lead you to the end. A few more days will determine the truth or falsity of all the reports now in circulation, reports being that Robert E. Lee had surrendered. In the meantime, let those who are now absent from their commands, for the purpose of mounting themselves or otherwise, return without delay. Be firm and unwavering, discharge promptly and faithfully every duty devolving upon you. Preserved untarnished the reputation you have so nobly won, and leave results to him," so this being him, God, "who in wisdom controls and governs all things." He said this on the 25th of April. 5 days later, he receives news that it is indeed the case from Richard Taylor, his commander, that it's true what happened, that Lee has actually surrendered. And I'll see if I can. I think there's another farewell address. So this where it says he's May 9th, 1865. It says, Civil war, such as you have passed through, naturally engenders feelings of animosity, hatred, and revenge. It is our duty to divest ourselves of all such feelings, and as far as in our power to do so, to cultivate friendly feelings towards those with whom we have so long contended. Neighborhood feuds, personal animosities, and private differences should be blotted out, and when you return home, a manly, straightforward course of conduct will secure the respect even of your enemies. Whatever your responsibilities may be to the government, to society, or to individuals, meet them like men. I have never on the field of battle sent you where I was unwilling to go myself, nor would I advise you now to a course which I would find myself unwilling to pursue. You have been good soldiers, you can be good citizens. Obey the law, preserve your honour, and the government to which you have surrendered can afford to be and will be magnanimous. N.B. Forrest, Lieutenant General. Because it's worth noting, like in February, he was promoted to Lieutenant General. Uh, so at the start of the war, he started out as a private and ended the war as a Lieutenant General, which is the highest rise any singular guy had gone through for every American Civil War. And yeah, and as you can see with those two farewell addresses, to his the latter farewell address as well as the previous one, very much of a very reconciliatory message, because people often will, because there's a lot of controversy that happens for Forrest after the war, which I'll get into. Very nuanced picture that can be, but so the thing about Forrest was he was in May. I think it was late April, early May. He was approached by Jefferson Davis as well as the rest of the Confederate government, who said, "Can you get us over to Texas, whereby we can continue the war?" Now, Forrest said to these guys, "Look, I'm going home," because at this point, he knows the war is over and he's heard Robert E. Lee has surrendered. He's not going to fight anymore because he's been away from his wife for such a long time. He's home. He started the war with a fortune of $1.5 million. He's now penniless, and he would suffer that for the rest of his life. Pretty much, he struggles trying to get back the pre-war fortune he had, and what's more, he's just weary, and that's, to be fair, that's perfectly the same for guys like Robert E. Lee. Like Robert E. Lee is also, and Joseph E. Johnston, they're also saying the same to their troops. They're saying, look, the war is lost. We now just need to accept it, and we need to accept it in our stride and do the best from which we can. Because the thing was, the main threat for the South at this point was the radical Republicans. Now, you did have Lincoln and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who they were not radical Republicans. They were very much of a conciliatory kind of background. But yeah, this is one thing the South. After the Civil War, you do get guys like Robert E. Lee, Joseph E. Johnston, P.G.T. Beauregard, and Forrest, who, in their own different ways, they mainly say to the Southerners, look, go ahead with Reconstruction, while also playing, because we've got to play the game against the radical Republicans who are the real threat. And that's the thing, yeah, because guys like Thaddeus Stevens, if you watch the film Lincoln from 2012, Thaddeus Stevens was very much of a sort of proto-Bolshevik in terms of some of the stuff he argued for, like revolutionary tribunals, land expropriations, wanted full-on, just that massive screening of a population from rich Southern planters like Forrest all the way down to the average Southern private. They were very much wanting harsh punitive measures to be done upon the South, whereas you get someone like Lincoln, who is a lot more moderate and he was a lot more reconciliatory. And yeah, so one thing about Forrest after the war, so he initially tries to go back to his plantation and plant cotton. He did have 200 slaves before the war, and after the war, I think all but 18 of them carry on working for him, which is an inconvenient fact for the Reddit tier kind of people, because when people think of slavery, they think of its worst aspects, and they think, oh well, no man would ever want to work for their master after the war. When in the case of Forrest, of his slaves, only 18 of them didn't want to carry on working for him. The other 182 carry on working for his plantation. And it was a situation where actually some Union officers, after the war, they actually went up to him and go, "It's no wonder you're one of the best guys we ever fought. Not only do your horses be so willing to fight for you, but also your blacks, also your former slaves." So yeah, it's fair to say that Forrest, yeah, I believe I did mention last week. Yeah, he was known to be quite hospitable towards his slaves, very well mannered. Because one thing, thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I probably will mention Ulysses Grant was also quite conciliatory towards the South as well, especially at Appomattox, with the general surrender terms. And guys like Forrest, for example, alongside Lee, were paroled, which in other words means so long as they don't do anything wrong, like take up arms against the North again, they'll be treated generously. And by and large, yeah, that's what happens with the Confederates. There's very few hangings. I think there was 2 guys I know of who were hanged. One guy was Henry Wirtz, who was in charge of Andersonville Prison, which, yeah, I can see why he was hanged from what little I know of it. And then there was a guy, I forget the guy's name, but he was in charge of a Saltville massacre, where apparently like 5 black men were killed off in a military hospital by this one Confederate officer. And yeah, that was the only other hanging you had after the Civil War. You did have guys arguing about guys like Jefferson Davis and Forrest and Lee and others should be hanged, but by those guys, yeah, they were paroled and they were not treated. I don't know too much about Andersonville Prison, but from what I've read, basically, it was the Henry Wirtz was a Swiss guy who very much neglected people in the prison. A lot of Union soldiers starved to death in that prison, apparently, or were just so maltreated that they died of poor treatment, and so he was hanged after the war. I don't know for certain. He certainly was for war crimes of that sort, because, as I said, there were only 2 guys throughout the entire Civil War that were done for war crimes. Now, on that topic as well of war crimes, it's worth noting that there were Northerners, especially like the New York Times, who guys like in the New York Times who were arguing that Forrest should be done for what happened at Fort Pillow. But the thing was, Sherman actually stuck out his neck for a bit stuck out his neck for Forrest, saying, look, what he did at Fort Pillow was no massacre. He was fully on board with what happened in wartime. So that's why Forrest never saw the inside of a prison cell for whatever he did in the Civil War. And as aforementioned, he did nothing wrong at Fort Pillow. So even if there was a court case against him, if we were to try and convict him and we were successful, it would have to be a very partisan affair for obvious reasons. Yeah, so just to get a glimpse of what Forrest's attitude was after the Civil War. So I'll read a letter that he wrote to Andrew Johnson after, because it's worth noting, on April 14th or 15th. I forget it's April 14th or 15th. He goes over to Ford Theatre and Lincoln famously gets assassinated. And then after that, you get Andrew Johnson becoming president. And yeah, so I'll quote to you this letter he wrote to Andrew Johnson. So he says, I am aware that I am at this moment regarded in large communities in the North with abhorrence as a detestable monster, ruthless and swift to take life, and guilty of unpardonable crimes in connection with Fort Pillow on the 12th of April, 1864. Perhaps at a time of political excitement so fierce and high as at present, this misjudgment of my conduct and character should not surprise me. Nevertheless, it pains and mortifies me greatly. Yet, if any good can be wrought from it, I am still willing to rest for a time longer under this heavy wounding weight of unreserved obloquy, without any attempt of that perfect justification before the world of my course as a soldier and commander in the storming of Fort Pillow, which I am satisfied I can make to the conviction of all fair-minded people, and in complete refutation of the ex parte proceedings of the Congressional Committee with their because it's worth noting, there was a congressional committee that said did war crimes at Fort Pillow, but that was a load of partisan bullcrap, as Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, would himself say. With their manifestly leading questions and willing witnesses whose prompted evidence should thenceforward mislead no one. I have, however, to appeal to the judgment of your Excellency in this regard, and to invoke your advice as to my present course, and especially whether the time is propitious or inauspicious for an attempt on my part to throw off the load of his widely believed and injurious calumnies, and I have presumed to make this appeal from a sincere desire to do nothing which shall in the least contribute to these sectional animosities which now render the country, struggling as you are, with an appalling with an appalling army of forces hostile to constitutional and regulated liberty. I have been unwilling to ask you for amnesty, which I felt your own sense of right had disposed you to grant me, much as it was desirable for the proper conduct of my greatly involved private fortunes. I have preferred to endure these private embarrassments rather than to give your vindictive enemies an opportunity to misrepresent your motives, were you to grant my amnesty. In conclusion, I shall continue to do all that I can to assuage any ill feeling and to promote a spirit of moderation and accommodation. I will say furthermore that should your Excellency deem it as likely to subserve the purposes of pacification, I would even waive all immunity from investigation into my conduct at Fort Pillow that might attach to my parole. I have the honour to remain your Excellency's obedient servant, Nathan Bedford Forrest. So yeah, that was a letter that Forrest wrote over to the president, Andrew Jackson, in the midst of all the Reconstruction, and yeah, it was a matter of you have this situation where Forrest, he, like with Sherman, because Sherman has his reputation of being some sort of a war criminal or whatever, and they go, he really wasn't, and I'll be starting William T. Sherman next week to talk more about. Forrest was also the same, and this is one reason why actually after the war, so in 1873, if I'm not mistaken, there looks to be a sort of war brewing between Spain and America over Cuba, because America's always had designs over Cuba. And Forrest actually writes a letter to William T. Sherman, who at that time was the commanding general of the U.S. Army when Grant was president. And he said to Sherman, "Look, if war happens, I will sign up if you will have me to command the cavalry." Now, William T. Sherman, to his credit, he did put him a good word for Forrest as commanding general of the U.S. Army, because in the heat of the Civil War, yes, Sherman really could bring himself to hate Forrest as a really dogged opponent, and this probably would be the best. Hold on, where is that quote? Here you go. And to quote William T. Sherman when it comes to the topic of Nathan Bedford Forrest, so General Sherman said, "After all, I think Forrest was the most remarkable man our Civil War has ever produced on either side. To my mind, he was the most remarkable in many ways. In the first place, he was uneducated, while Jackson and Sheridan and other brilliant leaders were soldiers by profession. He never read a military book in his life, knew nothing about tactics, could not even drill a company, and yet he had a genius for strategy which was original and to me incomprehensible. There was no theory or art of war by which I, William T. Sherman, could calculate with any degree of certainty what Forrest was up to. He seemed always to know what I was what I was going or intended to do, while I am free to confess I could never tell or form any satisfactory idea of what he was trying to accomplish." Very high praise. Like, it's often said that you can tell one of the greatest. He's a great general by, which guy gives the enemy the most anxiety. Well, in the case of Forrest, even Grant and Sherman, like the Perigiro, I would say, like the two generals who really brought down the South in the Civil War. Those two understood that Forrest was one of the most dangerous guys they had to deal with on the Western theatre. And yeah, it could be said that were it not for the water has not been able to be cut by Forrest. Like, basically, one of the main problems Forrest had was he was never appreciated by the Confederate government. Jefferson Davis himself said this after the war, where he said to Forrest, "Look, guys like Braxton Bragg and others just misrepresented Forrest in terms of his accomplishments. It was only after the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads they fully appreciated Forrest's genius. But by that point, it's the one. At that, I would say, if I was Jefferson Davis, I would have promoted Forrest as being in charge of all Confederate cavalry on the Western Theater by December 1862, because had Forrest commanded all cavalry on the Western Theater, he could have provided a real headache for Grant in context of the Vicksburg campaign, because the Vicksburg campaign was really was probably the most brilliant campaign of the American Civil War, from what little I know of it thus far, which I'll read about with Grant later on in this month. And the Vicksburg campaign split the Confederacy in half and was really the decisive campaign of the war, more than Gettysburg, although Gettysburg happened on the same day that Vicksburg had fallen. But yeah, if Forrest was appreciated a lot sooner in the war, at the very least, battlefield outcomes and strategic outcomes in the Western Theater would have gone a lot better. Even if Grant still won the war, it would have been a lot longer and be a lot more awkward for the Union to win. That's one of the great tragedies of the South in the Civil War, was some of the best guys were never fully appreciated and were not promoted until way too late in the war. So yeah, I meant to get on to so after the Civil War, Forrest tries to grow cotton, this time with free black labor, but it doesn't work out. One of the main problems being because the levees of these dams on the Mississippi were damaged by the war. So, given he lived in Memphis, which is not far from the Mississippi, it doesn't take much for his plantation to get flooded by the Mississippi every time there's a bad bit of rain or whatever. So Forrest fails at that. Then he gets into, as the image you see here, he got into railways in the early 1870s. Really inopportune time for him, because there were a lot of scandals. Plus, the Franco-Prussian War meant that the price of iron went up massively. So it was really inopportune for Forrest. But the railway companies were embroiled in scandal under Ulysses Grant's administration, especially down south in Alabama, where the Selma part of the railway had been taken over by the Alabama state government. And yeah, it was just a matter of, it just wasn't, like, whatever Forrest tried to do after the Civil War, he just couldn't make ends meet. And yeah, he couldn't get the pre-war fortune he enjoyed. Now, the main awkward bit about Forrest in terms of after the war was the KKK stuff. Now, the thing about KKK was when Forrest joined it, at that point in Reconstruction, and Reconstruction, I don't know too much about Reconstruction. I'm planning on doing a stream or two about it later on in the year. And the thing about Reconstruction is, because a lot of the literature about it was written from the 1960s onward, I'm really having to rely upon what a lot of people would call lost cause, or because the thing is, a lot of the pro-Northern sources, especially written from the 1960s onward, is just absolute left-wing bilge about Reconstruction. So I will try my best to be objective about stuff like Reconstruction on part of Forrest, especially. So the KKK, they originally formed because down south you had stuff like carpetbaggers, the loyal leagues, and other outfits of that sort, where you have the blacks and northern whites who come in and muscle in on, what someone says, they exploit either the bad economic conditions of the South after the devastation of the Civil War, like cotton. They just take all the cotton, confiscate it, and sell it on the market to enrich themselves. Very corrupt. And Shelby Foote himself, he would say that the Freedmen's Bureau was very corrupt. Now, I don't know too much about that. I would look into that later on in the year. But yeah, Reconstruction down south, it really was a mess. everyone botched it. The South botched it. The North botched it. The federal government botched it. The state government botched it. No one was really that innocent in the grand scheme of things. But like, if you were to listen to the average leftist talk about it, they're convinced that it's all the South's fault. When no, the South had fairly good reason to be fairly suspicious of Reconstruction, because you do have radical Republicans who were massively railing against Andrew Johnson. In Mississippi and Tennessee, there's a guy called Brownlow, who was a militarily installed governor. He was very ruthless. He was very much he was kind of like a dictator, I suppose you could say, in how he exercises authority. He spends his time mobilizing state militia, which is literally just blacks who take guns, and there's a lot of racial violence. Now, one thing about the KKK, I know, like, because I was on Duke's stream with Aaron Hook and Duke about the Trent affair, because one book I was reading about Stonewall Jackson was a book by George Henderson and Garnet Wolseley, and Garnet Wolseley visited the Civil War. He visited Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Nathan Bedford Forrest. So Garnet Wolseley is very much an interesting guy to look into, and I won't say now to do Anglo-Confederate relations. I think that, but yeah, you can do them back to Trent affair, because I did. I don't know how much I went into detail of it from memory, but I did go into some memory, especially around Anglo sympathies towards the South, as well as guys like Garnet Wolseley being very much of a, I don't want to say war tourist, but certainly he was very interested in the South, as were many British Army officers in the context of the Civil War. Yeah, so the thing about the KKK was, so it'd be fair to say that there were a lot of blacks in the immediate Civil War that they were very keen on victimizing the whites after the war. They were giving their freedom, and they were very gun happy, to say the least. And you do have cases where the KKK were out lynching these blacks. Now, you can't say the lynching was wrong, because, well, perhaps it should be left to the law. However, there was a perception that with guys like Brownlow, the federal governor in this area of the South, there was to be no fairness towards the Southerners. And indeed there wasn't, because Brownlow was a Southern Whig. So he was more in line with the radical Republicans than he was with Andrew Johnson's administration. It was only in 1869, I believe it was, or 68, if memory serves me right, that Brownlow, he becomes a congressman, I believe a senator, if memory serves me right, and he's replaced by a corps called Speaker Center. Now, Speaker Center was also a Republican. However, he wasn't particularly radical at all. He was fairly moderate, and guys like Forrest, at that point, when he becomes the governor, that's when Forrest says, "Look, there's no point for the KKK anymore. Like, we have our guy in power. Like, we have a guy who is fair to us at least, and so we don't need the KKK to act as a sort of paramilitary organization to defend the white rights down south." So this is where Forrest, he gets into disavowing the KKK, because it's also worth noting, when it comes to the KKK, there was an element of Forrest being a control freak in regards to it, because kind of had to be, because there are a lot of animosities, and Forrest doesn't want loose cannons. Unfortunately, there are quite a few loose cannons, and yeah, it's also worth noting Forrest didn't actually found it. It was a bunch of guys in Pulaski, among those one of his artillery guy, John Morton. John Morton was the guy who invited him, and that's how he comes into it. And yeah, the KKK was very much of a response to what they saw as a northern vengefulness, and northerners having their own paramilitary leagues, like the Loyal Leagues, and the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau is a government agency, but yeah, they were very much seen as agitators egging on the blacks against the whites. And it's worth noting, so people talk about Reconstruction. People talk about Reconstruction in the sense of, well, the South was all at fault. And go, it's worth noting that, with the exception of New England, the vast majority of northern states, such as Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, they themselves were unwilling to have any sort of black suffrage. So this is another thing where the Southerners are just very iffy about post-war Reconstruction, where they think, well, why are you giving blacks the vote down here when even in your own northern states you're not willing to give them the vote? So yeah, that's another thing, which is a fair point. Like the Northerners were not themselves racial egalitarians; they wanted slavery gone, but and this is a great tragedy with Lincoln's death. Like Lincoln wanted to ship all the blacks over to countries like Cuba, parts of Central America, as well as over to Liberia, because he didn't believe that whites and blacks could live side by side. And unfortunately, Andrew Johnson comes in and he's just all about restoring the states. And you have stuff like a black code, which basically show before, I believe he called it peonage, which peonage was kind of like it's kind of slavery, but with all the bad bits and none of the good bits, where there's no obligation on part of the contracts, because you have these contracts where you buy and sell these contracts to other people, and these contracts are basically slavery in all but name. But the problem was there was no formal obligation to look after the slave. So, and this is why you can find surveys from the 1930s where you have these former slaves who say, "Look, things were better under slavery than they are after slavery," and that's something which isn't really talked about, and it's a very iffy one, which I don't know how much you can talk about it on YouTube for obvious reasons, but let's just say it's a very nuanced time, and the South is not like the South is not the only guys you can say have some part of blame for Reconstruction. The North also were deeply hypocritical. So do the KKK? Yeah, you have three clans. The first clan came from 1866 from Pulaski, Tennessee, and they spread all over the South. At one point, I believe that Forrest actually said to the Northern Democrat convention up in New York in like 1868 or 69, there were 550,000 Southerners who were members of the KKK, or at least people who helped the KKK in any way, shape, or form. So it was very popular down south. The second clan you get in the 1910s under Woodrow Wilson, and with the third clan you get with the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. Technically, the third clan's still around today, but they're more of a LARP, if anything. So yeah, I forget. I don't know which date it was precisely in 1866, but yeah, it was set up in Pulaski, Tennessee, and yeah, this was where you get into. This is where, as I said, it's a very nuanced time. I can only. I don't know about the second or third, but I can. But there's a biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest. I will link beyond on the stream as he did for last week. Jack Hurst, he did a biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest from 1992, which has a particular section all about Nathan Bedford Forrest in the clan, and I will say it's fairly balanced because it will say, look, there are these anecdotes where these are black guys who were very much criminals who were lynched by the clan, but also it will also say that the clan were known for intimidating, but it's also worth noting he also does say, look, it was an element of self-preservation on part of the South for the clan to exist. So that's the only objective source I know for the first clan. Second and third clan, I haven't looked into it yet, but I might look into it at a later point because that's a very much interesting part of American history. The only reason I haven't said anything about it as of yet is because I don't know how YouTube treats that part of American history, because you've tried to, because God knows, basically, the average normie in America, for example, they have a completely warped view of this era of American history that is not, it's not black and white, to say the least. Like, yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, so the lynch white criminals. Yeah, it didn't, because of the book I was reading about, it didn't really mention white criminals all that much. But yeah, there were. I know carpetbaggers were a big target for lynching, and to be fair, the carpetbaggers, from what I read about them, I mean, I'm going to avoid Fed posting, but I would just say, look, I can understand why the Southerners hated them so much, because they really did exploit the South at a really bad time in their history. So yeah, it's a matter of like the Ku Klux Klan, like yes, you can say they weren't a good thing they weren't a good thing, but it's a lot more nuanced than simply KKK bad. Like it was a matter of certain circumstances unfolded, and yeah, it was just a matter of very traumatic period for all sides of it. And as I've mentioned earlier, the North were not willing to ratify black suffrage, which that's one thing that goes under the radar for a lot of normies, unfortunately. So yeah. Yeah, so that's a railway company. Around here on President Island, I believe, yeah, I think it was named after Andrew Jackson, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, Forrest has a farm around here which he operates using convict labor. I think that's the only time he really turned a decent buck after the Civil War, up until his death in 1877. And you got the Mississippi around here as it curves, and you've got President Island here, where there's a farm here Forrest owns, and it uses convict labor. Yeah, and to get that, and this is what Forrest kind of looked like after the Civil War. This is like a car to the east of him in 1868 or 69, because he was at a Democrat convention over in New York. Because it's worth noting so the KKK, they were formed because basically the Southerners did not think they had any legal avenue to resist against what they saw as Northern excesses and basically trigger-happy black and carpetbaggers and that kind of ilk. But once guys like Forrest are able to get the Democrat Party inside, and you have Democrats being able to win states, that's when the KKK kind of died down. Plus, also Ulysses Grant. One thing Ulysses Grant does, and this is another thing where people choose too black and white. So there's a Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, but the thing was that was struck down as unconstitutional because it said if you were suspected of being a Klansman, so not convicted, suspected, you could have your rights suspended. Which, of course, I'm not an expert on the first 5 amendments, but I imagine that does very much go against the spirit of the Constitution to have your rights gone because you are suspected of a crime, not convicted of a crime. And so, yeah, this is one of those things where this feeds into the narrative. And I must admit, like the Southerners are not 100% wrong when they say there was a lot of Northern excess done against them, especially with stuff like this Ku Klux Klan. In context of Tennessee, he does a lot to help the Democrat Party win the support of what they call the Neo-Confederates. So he does his fair share of helping, because it's worth noting that before the war, he was a Southern Democrat alderman over. He was a Southern Democrat alderman in Memphis, Tennessee, and yeah, it's a matter of the Democrat Party. They very much become a party of the South for a long time because of guys like Nathan Bedford, Forrest, and others. Because it's worth noting the Republican Party, they had what was called a radical Republican wing, who, if they were alive today, they'd be some of those insufferable cretins, like guys like Thaddeus Stevens, who, I know like, for some people they always said like there was that film called Birth of a Nation from 1915, which Woodrow Wilson screened, that shown Thaddeus Stevens having a black mistress. And people said, "Oh, that's just a racist rumor." Like people who were in support of Reconstruction at the time, but it was actually found to be the case. But actually, no, it was actually true. Thaddeus Stevens had a black wife, and he was very much of a. He was kind of a legalistic version of John Brown. I could do stream one day about John Brown, but I would say John Brown. I mean, there's a reason why the leftists celebrate him so much. Very if you see a picture of John Brown, very psycho-looking guy, and Thaddeus Stevens was kind of more that ilk where it's just like punishing the South, wanted basically full-on egalitarianism between blacks. He also wanted to give up. He wanted like 40 acres and a mule for the blacks, which. So you take land from white farmers down south, especially the big farmers, and give it to the blacks. But yeah, that's not a good solution for Reconstruction. And as I said, this is one of those things where the best thing should have happened where, it should have happened where the blacks should have been just paid to go over to Liberia, but the rest is history. Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, Jim Crow happens because of the neo-Confederates. For example, you have 1869. The Democrats take over Tennessee and Virginia, and then along the Deep South, basically over the course of Ulysses Grant's 2 terms in office, the neo-Confederates, as they're called, they take over one state after the other. For example, from the last state to become controlled by the neo-Confederates, I don't think it was Florida or one of the Carolinas, I believe it was. But yeah, basically this is where you get Jim Crow coming in, because yeah, this is one of those things where the black codes also come in, because there was what were called black codes, where basically it's like you have what called these contracts, as I've mentioned earlier, where it's basically slavery in all but name, and then Ulysses Grant comes in and outlaws that kind of arrangement. But the thing was, Reconstruction, as it was so badly done by the federal government and the state governments, like, and by the North and by the South, like, it was just a real mess. And the Southerners, because the American Colonization Society wasn't around by this point, it went bankrupt, I believe, in the midst of the Civil War. There was no organized lobby group to ship the freed slaves over to Liberia, so they were stuck with them. And this is where the South started getting into Jim Crow. Now, in hindsight, I will say Jim Crow, I'd say, yeah, this is a great tragedy of the South, was that they didn't ship all the blacks out after the Civil War, and instead they just had to go with Jim Crow because, well, similar reasons to apartheid in South Africa, very nuanced, but yeah, you just have this position where the blacks, they're voting radical Republicans, and there's quite a few black criminals who are just exploiting themselves, and they're really, really long-winded, and I can answer it more competently later on in the year when I study Reconstruction. But yeah, let's just say the South had good reasons for resisting Reconstruction the way they did, but also you can also say the South has its own part to blame for it going badly as well. It's really nuanced time in history. Indeed. All right, this is where I can have my own sort of anger towards someone like John Wilkes Booth, who really screwed the pooch in assassinating Lincoln. And Lincoln did want to ship all the slaves over to Liberia because I know there are some guys after Lincoln, because Ulysses, I don't think Grant also believed in it either. Like, he did fight for civil rights for blacks, but I think Grant, as well as another guy called James A. Garfield, who becomes president after him, after Rutherford B. Hayes in 1880, they both believed that a racially equal society between whites and blacks wasn't possible down south, and so the best solution would be to ship the slaves over to Liberia. But basically, a lot of these blacks, they just refused to go. So it's just this situation where, so you just have this situation where the blacks just refuse to go, and I would say, yeah, I don't. I'd say it's tragic for Seth, and also I'd say really the blacks shouldn't have been so stomach off him, because they shouldn't have been so stomach. I think the best thing for the blacks would have been they'd be all paid to go over to Liberia or to Cuba or to Central America, as per what guys like Lincoln, Grant, and James R. Garfield had believed. But yeah, it's a really nuanced time in history. It's not black and white at all. Yeah. I was reading about Lincoln's death, and Lincoln's assassination, and yeah, very much Lincoln's death was probably one of the worst things for the South in the long run, and very missed opportunity for America, unfortunately. I meant to quote. So Garnet Wolseley, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, I'm quoting what Garnet Wolseley, who was commanding the British Army in 1898, at the time that John Allen Wyeth's book, which I'm reading from, was written. So he said, Forrest had no knowledge of military science nor of military history to teach him how he should act what objective he should aim at, and what plans he should make to secure it. He was entirely ignorant of what other generals in previous wars had done under very similar circumstances. What he lacked in book knowledge or book lore was to a large extent compensated for by the soundness of his judgment upon all occasions and by his power of thinking and reasoning with great rapidity under fire, under all circumstances of surrounding peril or of great mental or bodily fatigue. Panic found no resting place in that calm brain of his, and no danger, no risk appalled that dauntless spirit. Inspired with true military instincts, he was verily nature's soldier. It would be difficult in all history to find a more varied career than his, a man who, from the greatest poverty, without any learning, and by sheer force of character alone, became a great fighting leader of fighting men, a man in whom an extraordinary military instinct and sound common sense supplied to a very large extent his unfortunate want of military education. His military career teaches us that the genius which makes men great soldiers is not to be measured by any competitive examination in the science or art of war. In war, Napoleon said, men are nothing, and man is everything. It will be difficult to find a stronger corroboration of his maxim than to be found in the history of General Forrest's operations. So yeah, I imagine in once people listening, as opposed to people who will listen after this, I imagine this stream has fully impressed upon everyone that Forrest really was a genius in warfare. Like, as in, he never went to West Point, only spent 6 months at school, and yet he had this great genius for warfare. And also, he was a very shrewd guy in terms of peacetime commerce. Unfortunately, after the Civil War, he does struggle, and it's through reasons that he can't really control, such as wartime damage to like ditches and damages to the Mississippi River, as well as, of course, railway venture. The thing was, basically scandal outside of his control under Ulysses Grant. Really terrible circumstances Forrest was in. So yeah, next stream ought to be next week. I don't know if it'll be next Thursday or Friday. It depends. But it'll be next Thursday or Friday, and I'll be doing it about William T. Sherman. Thing about William T. Sherman and Nathan Bedford Forrest was they were two guys who they earned a reputation from this war they did not covet. So Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's mainly known for Fort Pillow, which really wasn't a massacre. Everything was hunky-dory on part of Forrest, that one, as mentioned earlier. And William T. Sherman gets known mainly for his March to the Sea. There is that song, Marching Through Georgia, which there are anecdotes where some guys tried to play in front of him and he just walked out of the room because he was so disgusted by people whenever they played that song near him, because he actually hated that. Sherman wasn't a man who gloried in suffering or war, as much as his reputation might suggest. So yeah, that'll be one of the main focuses I'll do for William T. Sherman, was that he was a manic depressive. So one thing I found about a lot of great military minds of the Anglosphere is that they all suffer from manic depression, or really disadvantaged individuals, or really autistic. In the case of someone like Stonewall Jackson, Stonewall Jackson being heavily autistic. You've got Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a genius despite never having spent a single minute in military schooling before the Civil War, similar to Cromwell in the English Civil War, leading his Ironsides cavalry. And then you have someone like Sherman, as well as Cromwell, who both suffered from manic depression. And like there's a book I've got by Charles Royster called The Destructive War. I'll probably link it below, because I did mention it in my first stream about Stonewall Jackson. That book says basically, Stonewall Jackson and Sherman, Sherman was ridiculed by the Union side because he said total war was going to be the mainstay, and that it was going to involve immense human suffering, and many people ridiculed him for it. After Shiloh, however, no one was laughing at him anymore. Stonewall Jackson was also the same. Like he said to Jefferson Davis, we ought to go into Pennsylvania and Ohio and just tear up all the infrastructure that could support a war effort. And in so doing, tell the North how brutal a war with the South could be. But Jefferson Davis didn't listen, and well, rest is history on that one. So yeah, the only reason I won't do because Apostolic Majesty and Charlemagne did that stream on Robert E. Lee, didn't they? And I will say it's a really good stream. I will say I probably would do streaming one day about Robert E. Lee, but that'd be more about the generalship rather than a full-on biographical stream. To be fair, because as I said, Apostolic Majesty and Charlemagne, they did a really good biographical stream. Well, it's pretty long, like 4.5 hours, I believe it was. Try 4 hours, something like that. Really long stream, and you have to take it in chunks. But yeah, that's the only reason I haven't done Lee is basically because other people have done him, and I don't want to step on Apostolic Majesty's toes on that one. So that's the only reason I don't think I'm going to do Lee as a biographical stream like I have done for Stat Jackson and Forrest thus far. And after I'm done with William T. Sherman, I'll be doing Ulysses S. Grant, and then for a time I'll just take a break from the Civil War and I'll see what other stream topics I'll do after that full time. But I know on July the 3rd, which is a Friday, I'm planning on doing a stream about Gettysburg. So I might talk a bit of Robert E. Lee on that stream, and because I've got like 5 books about Gettysburg, or 4, but the 5th one's more of a just for the maps really. Just how many because I'm a very visual learner when it comes to battles. So yeah. But yeah, the thing about Sherman was, yeah, that was the thing. Like, Sherman, I can feel for him, and also one of the funniest things about American Civil War historiography is how many leftists genuinely think that guys like Sherman would be on their side today, and I'm like, no. Sherman, if anything, like Sherman, it's worth noting that if he was alive today, he would be saying the same racist stuff as I would on Discord, or the same racist stuff as any of us would say on Discord. So yeah, I do quite like Sherman from what little I know of him. I've got his personal memoirs. I'm literally on my window ledge, within arm's reach. So yeah, As I mentioned, next week I'll start on William T. Sherman. It's probably going to be in 2 parts because, as I said, because there's a lot of ground to cover, and also if you read Sherman's memoirs, it's like the first half covers right at the Atlanta campaign, and then second half covers the Atlanta campaign through to. Because Sherman wrote his memoirs, I believe, like a decade before he died, because he died in 1885, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote the memoirs in 1875. But yeah, so yeah, you can imagine. Ulysses S. Grant. I can imagine each stream of him will take 2.5 hours because there's so much ground to cover and so many battles to take into again, strategy and so on. Plus, also, there's a bit of a controversy over how he chucks out the Jews in Mississippi because they were profiteering basically of the Civil War, and Grant, who very good man by nature. If that's the thing, like if you irk Grant off enough that he feels a need to chuck you out of Mississippi, you really have to be a terrible person to do that, because Grant was a very trusting guy. He was very eager to see the good in people, and the fact that he chucks out the Jews kind of tells you a lot about that particular group historically. So I will say no more of that, lest YouTube flag it up or whatever. But yeah. So yeah, I hope this stream was informative and educative. I know that, for example, someone like Iron Duke, he's not too clued on the American Civil War beyond Eastern Theatre and that kind of stuff. So it's educational for guys like him and other great people. And to paraphrase one book I read by Thomas Jordan, which I posted about in Apostolic Majesty's Discord, where it says at the end of that book, to paraphrase, if this stream hasn't taught you enough of how much of a genius and how much of a great man he really was, how much of a great man Forrest truly was in terms of his generalship. That I failed. I don't know when Mr. is. I haven't read it yet. I've got the audiobook. I might listen to the audiobook in the weekend, and I might talk about it next week. If I forget, don't be afraid to remind me next week. But I will, because I've also got a PDF of it as well. If in that case as well, on my Z library. So yeah, I probably will read it alongside Sherman because I'm very good at multi-reading. Yeah, I can be really autistic about my reading. But yeah, good night all, and I'll end the stream here. Just to reiterate, yeah, I will be reading that Colonel H book probably in the weekend because I've really just done like a few hundred pages, and I'm a very good reader. So of how many pages I can read, so I'll talk about it next week. So farewell. I'll see everyone here next week talking about William T. Sherman. I don't know if I'll do a poll about, because I've got two names. I've either got the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in one, because he truly was or I've got the Scourge of the South, but Scourge of the South sounds too cliche, so I might go with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in one as a title for that stream. But yeah, I could do a poll on it on my Twitter or on YouTube, depending on which. But yeah, so this ends it, and I hope this stream has been very informative. So I'll say farewell to you all, and see you next week.